mapping the headwinds, acceleration, attention, and optimization. So the way I want to talk a little bit about unleashing leaders, as I see it, is to speak first about what we're unleashing disciples from, then how we're unleashing them, and then what we're unleashing them to. And then talk a little bit more about the how again at the end. So the way that I tend to talk is a lot about I begin as I'm not a confessional Lutheran, or I'm a confessional Lutheran, but I'm not denominationally a Lutheran, but I'm told that I'm a Lutheran by all sorts of people all the time, and I take it as a compliment. So everything that I'm speaking to you from comes from a fierce devotion to the distinction between the law and the gospel, and the Reformation solas, and the theology of the cross, and the bondage of the will. These are near and dear to my heart. But the way that I get there is usually by talking about the culture around us, sort of going from the bottom up, to borrow a sort of Lutheran phrase. So if you're not with me at the beginning, I hope you'll stay with me, because I think I'm going somewhere with this. Well, okay. What is happening I've come to you from Charlottesville, Virginia, Central Virginia, Thomas Jefferson land, to Fergus Falls, which is, in my mind, like the real America. I was at the Viking Cafe this morning, and every single booth was occupied, and people were actually looking at each other and talking, and there was an American flag outside, and what looks like an incredible community theater, and I felt like I traveled back in time a little bit, because I didn't see a bunch of people on screens. It was very refreshing. It was very cool. But what's happening in Central Virginia, where I live, is kids are being hustled to summer camps. And I actually dropped a child off to go to a summer camp, a Christian camp, on my way here. And I've got 3 sons. I've got a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 9-year-old. So I'm thoroughly in the taxi cab phase of raising children. And so what every day is, we think, oh, summer's going to be a break. But for my wife and I, it's like, no, who's picking up who, where, and when, and how are we getting them there? And this is on top, this kind of running around like crazy is on top of us having had to register these kids for summer camp last September, really, where we are. It's a snooze-you-lose situation in Central Virginia, where everyone is trying to get into a few of these sports camps, or even VBS is a little bit more of an open-door policy, thank God, but there are limited spots available. And every year, the deadline to register those kids gets sooner and sooner and sooner. So it seems like the summer isn't even done before you're registering for the next summer. So what I'm trying to describe to you is the feeling of being a person in America in 2026, not in Fergus Falls perhaps, but in Jefferson land, which is a feeling of acceleration. Everything is getting faster and faster and faster. The theologian Andrew Root once talked about, he said, modernity is the constant process of speeding things up. When we're talking about unleashing leaders and disciples, we are unleashing them from a culture of relentless acceleration. Now, what am I talking about? Clearly, I'm talking about phones and summer camp. But I'm also talking about letters which became phone calls, which became text, which became real-time Slack messages. I'm talking about what is called today dopamine culture. Do you know what dopamine culture is? This is the world in which many of us are raising children. Traditional culture, you played a sport. Modern culture, you watch a sport. Dopamine culture, you gamble on a sport. Go Knicks. All right. That's what I'm talking about. But if you watch, what's so amazing about what's happening with the Knicks is people are actually watching the game. They're not watching one player to make sure he gets this amount of scores so that they win and then you do a parlay on this. If you don't know what I'm talking about, God bless you. But the numbers around online sports gambling in America are so devastatingly large that if you're not talking about it in your church, you're probably not talking about the lives people are actually leading. It's that prevalent among young men. Journalism, newspapers, multimedia to clickbait. Music, which is, for me, very important. We went from albums to tracks to TikToks. We have relationships, goes from courtship and marriage to sexual freedom to swiping on an app. You know what I'm talking about. Dopamine culture is simply a way that, Ted Gioia is the guy who defined this term. And he's basically saying that sometime in the last decade or so, distraction became the predominant mode of culture rather than entertainment, which is based on body chemistry rather than fashion or aesthetics. Gioia wrote that our brains reward these brief bursts of distraction. The neurochemical dopamine is released, and this makes us feel good, and so we want to repeat the stimulus. And so to be a person today is to be captive to acceleration. We know that the economy accelerates every year. Markets rise and fall, but have you tried buying a used car recently? It's never, the groceries, I don't have to tell you even about this, but you know what I'm talking about. The way that Hartmut Rosa, the German sociologist, says that every year we have to run a bit faster to keep what we have. How about travel sports? We see the acceleration there. I could keep going. But the overall picture I'm trying to paint is of life as a treadmill on which the dial keeps getting moved upward. We all feel it. The fast track keeps getting faster. The pressure to keep up that much heavier. The fruit of this acceleration is manifold, but three byproducts worth mentioning right now that speak to the spiritual conditions of those we're trying to unleash or evangelize or simply minister to are anxiety, alienation, and fatigue. If the pace of life is ratcheting up every year, so too does our anxiety. It can't not. If you're trying to accomplish more in less time, this is what happened. I just had the immense privilege last night of getting a tour of a farm, of the Ronnevic farm, very close by. And one of the main things that Knut told me, the farmer there, was just how much 10 years ago he had a tractor that could plant seeds at 5 miles an hour. But now he has one that can plant them at 10 miles an hour. Now that doesn't sound, that's like the difference between going like this versus going like this, but that's twice as fast. Acceleration in farming, we see it there too. Reflection in an age of acceleration starts to feel like a luxury that we cannot afford while we're barreling from one thing to the next. It's not a recipe for spiritual well-being. Serenity is never frenzied. But very often, this hurry manifests not just as anxiety, but alienation. The loss of connection. I know that you see this in your own populations and contexts. This is what I hear over and over. Because you cannot feel connected to your surroundings, especially the other people in those surroundings, if you don't have time to invest in them. If church becomes a consumer experience where you simply take, you actually won't feel connected to it unless you can give as well. And if you are a church with a lot of young families, you know that it's a tough ask to ask folks who are chickens with their heads cut off to give more. And yet that actually is the solution to the disconnection we feel. Acceleration pinches our available minutes. And often the first things to get the axe are those that don't bring an immediate or measurable return. But they're also the same activities that tend to yield the most connection. The third fallout of acceleration is exhaustion, which should speak for itself. Adolescents aren't getting enough sleep. Teachers are barely standing. Every single member of the clergy I know needs a sabbatical, not just the young or the middle-aged or the almost to the retirement age. Everyone needs a sabbatical. Everyone's tired, and we're even tired of the word tired, right? We're burned out on the word burnout. Today we talk about fatigue, compassion fatigue, political fatigue, Zoom fatigue, crisis fatigue, inflation fatigue, volunteer fatigue, donor fatigue, Taylor Swift fatigue. It's real. Religion, church is not immune to acceleration, is it, my friends? We often fall, I think, prey to the assumption that growth, personal, communal, institutional, is the end-all, be-all of what happens on Sundays. And of course, we want, as Christians, we want to follow the Great Commission. We want to unleash disciples. We want to create new leaders. And yet, what are we unleashing them to? Just a spiritual form of what people are already living in? Or something altogether different? Online acceleration is, though, worth talking about a bit more. And I'm going to try to make it through these first two talks without mentioning the phrase AI. I promise. I'm going to talk about it in the third one. I know don't roll your eyes yet. What is online acceleration? What is the internet? What has it become? How has it formed us? How has it shaped us? What are the people wanting to be unleashed from who are sunken and defined by life online? Well, one of my favorite podcasts called, I love it so much I've forgotten the name. Shoot, it's going to come to me in a second. The internet in 2026 is dominated by a few social media platforms that are brilliant at harvesting our attention by appealing to our worst instincts. Brilliant at harvesting our attention by appealing to our worst instincts. And so what you have is an acceleration of antagonism, an acceleration of grievance, an acceleration of revenge seeking, dunking, scorekeeping. There was one of the humor websites I follow online had a great headline recently. It says, "Woman decides to unwind by reading 1,000 people's thoughts on the 68 most horrible things that happened that day." One way to talk about this form of acceleration is by talking about the attention economy. This is something I think all pastors and anyone in ministry is well versed in. It is that the attention has become the most precious resource that people have. It's not actually their money, it's their attention. It has value, and if you can seize someone's attention, you can seize that value. Those who successfully extract it command fortunes and topple regimes. The battle to control what we pay attention to at any given instant structures our inner life. Who and what we listen to, how and when we are present to those we love, and our collective lives. Every single aspect of human life across the broadest categories of human organization is being reoriented toward the pursuit of attention. It is the defining resource of our age, and it's one that many of you likely feel like you are in competition with the internet to get people's attention. You're in competition with the political discourse to get people's attention. You're in competition with travel, sports. I don't know what it is. But it's a commodity, almost. And in fact, to minister to people in contempt today's world is to understand the gap between what we ought to pay attention to and what we do pay attention to. We often, I think, talk about the way that the law of God, or the law, sort of the little L law, is working on people in our world. And it very much is, it used to be the distance between who I present myself to be online and who I actually am. That's my profile versus myself. That was a very helpful metaphor for a long time. Or at least for a little while. But now people don't really have profiles. Now, if you want to get to how guilty someone feels, You talk to them about the difference between what they know they ought to pay attention to and what they actually pay attention to. I know I should be spending time with my loved ones, but I just keep scrolling. I don't know why, but I just keep scrolling. So that's the first headwind. The second headwind is what I would call metricization, and its cousin, optimization. Metricization and optimization. This is something folks in the church, I think, deal with in an acute way, where everything has a number attached to it now. I can tell you how well I slept using a number. I can tell you how stressed I am using a number. I can tell you exactly how many people have been coming to church this Sunday for the last 6 years. I can tell you how many people are streaming our service online. I can tell you how many confirmants we had. I can tell you how many people are coming to our youth convention. By the way, great work. So that's very encouraging. I'm a person who operates online a lot of times, so I can tell you what my book sales are. I can tell you how many people are listening to my podcasts. I can tell you how many people are attending our events. This is linked, this sort of social quantification of all things is linked pretty clearly to the screened life and to the instances of depression in people. If you are being measured at all times and there's no end to it, well, then what you're confronted with is the law without any gospel at all times. It's a very, very hard way to live. There is, of course, a utility to metrics. We'd like to know if church attendance has really fallen off a cliff. It's good to know that. How many parking spaces do we need? How many volunteers do I need? These are important things to know, but we're not living in that world anymore. We're living in a world where things are only valued to the extent they can be measured. And for folks who are interested in things like making disciples who follow Jesus, we should be concerned because Jesus seemed pretty uninterested in numbers and metrics in the way that we are. It just wasn't, efficiency wasn't at the top of the list of priorities you find in the New Testament. In fact, what happens to us, I think, all too often is we get captured by a certain value or statistic. One thing that was meant to measure something good becomes the thing that we start to teach to. It's like teaching to the test when you're a teacher. It's important to know how many people are streaming our service online on a Sunday, but then all of a sudden we get fixated on that number. We start to curate our services around that. Do you know what I'm talking about? The phrase is value capture, and it's when we outsource our values to a single statistic. And this happens more and more. There's a wonderful book about this called The Score, which came out this year. I recommend it to anyone who's living in this over-metricized world. And it's about a guy named C.T. Nguyen, who's a philosophy professor in Utah. He puts it this way. He says, I got into philosophy because I loved it. I was supposed to be something else as an Asian immigrant's kid, a doctor, a lawyer, at worst, a lawyer. But I just kept getting pulled into these weird, fascinating questions like, is beauty subjective? What is the meaning of life? And then I went to philosophy grad school, and in grad school I encountered the rankings. There are two rankings people care about in philosophy grad school. One is a ranking of journals by status, and the other is a ranking of departments, philosophy departments by status. These are on websites, they're public. And you get focused on going up the rankings. Now, high-end philosophy journals typically feature very technical, careful, slow work on a set of fairly prescribed questions. This work can be important and valuable, but it wasn't my jam, he writes. I found myself working on it, which is kind of weird because no one goes into philosophy or the ministry because they're interested in worldly success. But then suddenly I found myself working on things that I was bored by for like 5 years, and I got super depressed. And I lost my love of philosophy, and I was going to quit. He got obsessed with the score, with the ranking, with the law. And in this case, the thing that I did was I had to basically ignore the ranking system altogether. I had to get rid of it completely, and I started working on the philosophy of games. And you could read what he came up with in this wonderful book. But this sort of metricization, it might sound to you like it's just basically benign. But it's what fuels a deeper problem, which is the problem of optimization. Optimization. Now that we can talk about AI with. If you talk to folks at a party, especially if I'm in an exercise group of just men, and we're constantly trying to optimize the heck out of each other's lives. Oh, that's a good thing you're eating. Well, let me tell you this other thing you should eat instead. Here's a way to maximize your priorities. Here's a new bit of software to organize your efficiency. Make life more manageable. We're inundated with things that promise to make us better, faster, stronger, which is supercharged by our devices, but the language it speaks is the language of metrics. There's an article last month in GQ about happiness trackers. I always joke that I was, when you're a person who is in the business of serving communion, I do the chalice all the time. You keep track of of wrist wear fashion, right? You're very aware of what is occupying people. Well, what people are putting on their wrists a lot these days are sort of aura rings and trackers that track how your pulse is going, how many steps you're taking. And it's easy to take shots at these things, but it's one thing to track how many steps you've taken, and another thing for something to tell you how happy you are. Research by UC Berkeley's Iris Mouse shows that the more you value happiness, the less happy you are. There's a psychological paradox when it comes to the pursuit of happiness. The more you seek it out, the more fixated you become on getting that ring to show the right color, the worse you actually feel. She says, I do worry that happiness trackers like these can exacerbate this tendency. So optimization, to the extent it fosters value capture, it will promise to cure people's headaches, answer their spiritual questions. But in fact, it just provokes more of them. Headaches, questions, misery. As an aside, I think the lingo of optimization sneaks in the idea that we're machines into our common language and self-understanding, which is it's not a biblical understanding of the human being. Nowhere in the Bible does it say anything about how you are wired. Nowhere do we hear about how you need to upgrade certain things in your life. There's no code in your veins. The heart cannot be hacked any more than the mind can be downloaded. These metaphors can be useful, but when we default to them, we enshrine optimization and productivity and metrics as the be-all, end-all of human existence. This is dehumanizing, and this is something from which people need to be unleashed. But with optimization, before long, what you have is parents who are reticent to enroll their kids in any after-school activities that don't produce a measurable growth in their child's development. Fun, play, friendships, faith, also known as the most important parts of childhood, these things take a back seat to activities that produce a quantifiable outcome. Now, this is all well and good when it comes to machines, which are essentially instrumental. They exist to produce specific outcomes. But when a human being's value is reduced to the output they may or may not produce, dignity is the casualty. And if you take a broader look at the culture in which we're living, what you're seeing is a decline not only in in-person interactions, you're seeing a decline in everything that doesn't have, it can't be measured. Dinner parties, for example. People are having a lot less dinner parties. They're entertaining less. Sleepovers for children are happening less. Dancing is happening less than it ever has. There's no more people starting bands, apparently, just because, how are you going to put that on your resume? Christians, of course, have an added reason to decry all this stuff. It's that efficiency, as I said, is foreign to Jesus. His time management was not great. It wasn't. He did not make strategic use of the resources at his disposal. I can't imagine a less machine-like modus operandi than that of Jesus Christ. He took breaks at inopportune times. When a storm was raging on the Sea of Galilee, what was Jesus doing? He was napping. What? Why? This is who he was. This is our Lord and Savior. He did not succumb to the hurry and the hard-nosed calculatedness that characterizes the culture of optimization. He was involved in the unleashing of those around him from precisely that sort of hurry. This is early in Mark's gospel. You know the passage. In the morning, while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came to do." This is what he came to do. He's withdraws. He retreats. Even early on, there's so much demand for him, and yet he's out there praying. He's out there spending time with God. And the anxious, the anxiety-ridden disciples who want more to be done come and interrupt him. And yet he doesn't respond to them with a wagging finger or a lecture about deceleration. No, he just comes to them with renewed focus. It's time to continue preaching the gospel. Let's go to the neighboring town. Now, before I talk about the third headwind, I want to see if there's any sort of thoughts, questions, comments that you all have about this. Anyone want to throw something into the bucket? All right. The third headwind is, I love this, by the way. This is a great New Yorker cartoon. These kids are building sandcastles. You're wasting your time. You should be building equity. This attitude, that's the attitude of optimization. Don't waste your time enjoying God's creation. You need to be increasing your bottom line, climbing whatever ladder I deem important for you to climb. This is what we are to be unleashed from, I believe. The third headwind, Jordan just kindly read my bio, is something I call seculosity. Seculosity is a catch-all for religiosity that's directed at earthly rather than heavenly targets. Seculosity is one of the answers, I think, to the question of why we're so anxious, lonely, and divided. We hear about how people are going to church less, how there's less belief in God, and we assume that folks are abandoning faith or making their own meaning. But what these polls don't tell us is that the marketplace in replacement religion is booming. I mean, in fact, what the kind of, I guess, pithy, tweetable summary of that book is the problem these days is not that we're less religious than we used to be, but that we're too religious about too many things. We're seldom not in church. It's just not the good kind of church. It's not the Jesus church. It's not the LB. Religious observance hasn't faded along with quote-unquote secularization. It's just migrated. And we've got the anxiety to prove it. Be summed up by Megan O'Geeblin, is a favorite writer of mine. And she talks about, she says, as more and more Westerners leave behind religious belief, instead of becoming purely rational agents, we increasingly displace those religious enthusiasms onto other things. I don't know if she's a German, by the way. I don't know if she knew she was using the word enthusiasm in a sort of a German type way, a Lutheran kind of way, but it makes sense. Here's what I'm talking about. This is Silicon Valley from a couple years ago. Turn customers into fanatics, products into obsessions, employees into ambassadors, and brands into religions. Unfortunately, some religious figures have responded by saying, well, we'll just turn our religion into a brand. And so my personal brand as a pastor is what I need to be curating constantly. Not just shepherding a flock, not just trying to love my family well, not just trying to keep Sunday mornings basically going okay. I also need to put forward a personal brand into the world. This is Audible bought this church, I think it's in Seattle, and they redubbed it the Innovation Cathedral. That kind of says all you need to know. We live in a culture where it's the entrepreneurs are our cultural heroes, not the poets. Another example of seculosity, I like this one. This is the seculosity of sort of romance. Sally, will you make me the happiest man in the world and accept full responsibility if I should fail to be the happiest man in the world? I love it. Here's another way in which seculosity rears its head. This is the LaCroix can. 0 calories, 0 sweetener, 0 sodium equals innocent. What? Not healthy, not tasty, not hydration, but absolution. That's a nice thing to get in a can that says lacrosse on it. But what is your religion, though, when I'm talking about this? When we're talking about what we're trying to unleash people from, because I want folks to deconstruct their replacement religion. It's not that hard because it wears people out. Your religion, or in a sort of a small r sense, is simply that which a person relies on for not just meaning or hope, but for what I call enoughness. Whatever road a person is taking, and what T.S. Eliot says is the endless struggle to think well of ourselves. What good Lutherans understand to be the road that people are taking in their own self-justification project. Listen carefully, you'll hear that word enough everywhere, especially when it comes to the anxiety and the loneliness and the exhaustion and the division that plague our moment to such tragic proportions. You'll hear about people scrambling to be successful enough, happy enough, thin enough, wealthy enough, influential enough, desired enough, charitable enough, good enough, optimized enough. We believe instinctually that were we to reach some benchmark in our minds, then value and vindication and love would be ours. That if we got enough, we would be enough. And therefore, we edit our personalities to maximize the approval of others, or we exaggerate hardships to make ourselves seem more heroic and other people more villainous. In that book, I talk about the religion of parenting, the religion of romance, the religion of career success, of food, of personal authenticity, and most palpably today, the religion of politics. These new religions go by different names, but they all function more or less the same. They cast a vision of enoughness and then implore us to realize that vision with forbearance, grit, and a lot of hard currency for the sake of existential reward. If you eat well enough, if you love well enough, if you parent well enough, if you stay busy enough, you will be enough. So this third headwind, after acceleration, and it's prone to acceleration, after metricization. This third headwind is simply the replacement religion that maintains all the demand and much of the ritual, but none of the mercy of the religion of Jesus Christ. Jesus is missing. It's all law and no gospel, in other words. If we are looking to unleash leaders, if we are looking to make disciples, are we looking to make a religious version of what they're currently living in, or are we trying to bring them into the kingdom of God in a way that upends, expands, and sort of gloriously deconstructs all of their preconceived notions and all that which has us captive and leashed? Because make no mistake, all of this adds up to despair. It adds up to despair. The New Yorker last week ran a whole long thing about why birth rates are declining as badly as they are. Have you read about this? It's very interesting. We are on demographic cliff in terms of fertility rates in this country and in the West. And what they reported was that young people in particular feel like they've lost the future as something to look forward to. They feel trapped in a world that is careening out of control. A survey conducted last year by Pew Research found that only 14% of Americans would transport themselves to the future if given the chance. Nearly half say they'd prefer to live in a past epoch. That's not an attitude that would produce the Jetsons or excite things about flying cars. Back to the Future 2. That's a very sad people. They look ahead and they see mostly malevolence, oligarchy, AI overlords, whatever it may be. I think the ultimate thing that I'm trying to hammer to you in this opening talk, which is not to be a downer to be a downer's sake, but to say that the unleashing that is our heart's desire, and that is not only that is sort of the great privilege that the Lord has placed upon many of us, is not just a vanity project. It is a desperately, desperately needed and exciting enterprise. And yet it is one that we are not up to the task to. W.H. Auden, the New York poet, the English poet actually, he wrote this about Advent. We who must die demand a miracle. How could the eternal do a temporal act, the infinite become a finite fact? Nothing can save us that is possible. We who must die demand a miracle. For those who are captive and leashed by optimization, metricization, acceleration, and seculosity, our only hope to be found is that of the gospel. A God who intervenes on behalf, in the place of those who cannot do that for themselves. And he does so in the form of Jesus Christ, who tells the famous parable of the workers in the vineyard, which is one that I sort of think becomes more radical with every passing day. You know the parable. A landowner hires men first thing in the morning to work his vineyard, then comes back to the marketplace a few hours later to hire more, then again a few hours after that, then once more before the end of the day. And at sundown, he pays them all the same, which is a full day's wage. Those who arrive first are miffed and proceed to voice their displeasure, but the landowner stands his ground. He does not penalize anyone involved, least of all those who are most clearly and disrespectfully hampered by an excessive devotion to what they feel their productivity, their optimization, has brought them. No, they get the same paycheck. Christ is painting a portrait of a place where reward is not a matter of output or merit or metrics, but grace, where we are valued according to our presence rather than our accomplishment, where all the boss seems to require of his workers is their need. This is unfair and it's offensive to the early risers, but it's of deep comfort to those who get there late, to the inefficient, to the unproductive, to the sinners, which it turns out is all of us. The parable sketches a Jesus-centered gospel, one in which love and esteem are not parceled out on the basis of numbers, where men and women aren't evaluated according to how well they stack up against others on an ever-accelerating scale, No, they are evaluated on the largeness of divine generosity, which is a picture, I believe, of enormous hope for those who are hopelessly leashed to forces beyond their control. And now, are there any thoughts, questions, comments? This is what we're trying. This is if we're asking the question of what we're unleashing people from. There's tons of things I haven't talked about, but I just wanted to give you a few, sort of maybe some fresh language, perhaps. Did I see a hand back there? No. Yes. What are we being unleashed to? Well, funny you ask. I have a lot to say about that. I think that not only the proclamation of the good news of the gospel, but the encounter with the living God at the center of that gospel is what we are unleashed to. And it's not something that is subject to our control, our manipulation, or our even really our leveraging. But it is good news to a world that is drowning, I think, in bad news. Yes? How do you become unleashed? I guess I should just keep going then with the next session. I believe it's an act of God that people are unleashed by, but I think that without preachers, how would they hear? I think that what the great privilege and calling of the Christian ministry is to be a witness to what has unleashed you in your life. I mean, why are you in this room? Yes. If y'all didn't hear, he was just mentioning about Sabbath, the practice of Sabbath being a completely countercultural practice. That book, the John Mark Comer book, which reclaims for the sake of this almost like an act of resistance to the accelerants that we face. I am all in favor of Sabbath and digital Sabbaths and otherwise. I just think it's important for folks, especially of my own theological tradition, to remember that the command to keep the Sabbath is the law. And that is not ultimately what unleashes people. The law, as beautiful and true and holy as it is, we should not. What do people do these days? They you have a little locker for your phone. Do you know this thing? You have a locker for your phone. You keep it outside the bedroom, so it's never in there. If you're doing that, that's great. Are you? Is anyone here doing that? Or are you still doing it if you started it last 2 weeks ago? I mean, it's a wonderful idea. I just don't think that we often look to the law to save and to unleash. The law doesn't do that. Even when its form is gracious, which is to people drowning in a sea of technological distraction and anxiety, I think we can do everything we can as pastors to introduce the idea of a Sabbath, to say, hey, have you considered that maybe that using this anxiety machine as a alarm clock and putting it right next to your ear before you go to sleep isn't the best idea for your mental, spiritual health? But try it with your congregation and see how well it works. I think people will just start lying to you afterwards about what they're doing. So that's how it always works with the law. They will initially be really excited about it, and then about 3 weeks they'll just be like, yeah, I'm still doing it. So there's in the place of failure, we have the opportunity to point people to a crucified and risen Savior, which has no fresh task to it. It's a spiritual and metaphysical reality that is almost exists apart from your ability to grasp it. It is not contingent upon your keeping of the law. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of the things that you described is relatable on a generational level. As where I land is like I'm squarely as millennial gets. I feel like what's coming out for like Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and maybe this has just always been the case, is this kind of skepticism of older generations. Where are you seeing this social acceleration and maybe an apathy to it, or how are you seeing it played out in Z and Alpha?
Well, there's a deeper hunger, I think, in Z and Alpha. I'm sure some of you have seen the statistics about younger people coming back to church. That this is the first generation where people are going to church more than they did the generation before. That Gen Z is going to church on a more frequent basis than millennials. And we wonder why. It's because they're the digital natives who've been brought up with this stuff and realize they want something more. I see there to be a real hopefulness about that. It's a following of a death-resurrection paradigm, though. It's not the following of people feeling like they're getting better and better in every way. It's kids who have been so burnt out by the digital shackles in which they were raised that they're hungering for something different. Yes? Yeah, I think so it was interesting, this optimization question, it's the one that tests with the most potency among Gen Z. This idea that there's a correct answer to everything and that their whole life is about making everything as efficiently as humanly possible. If it sounds academic to you, it's actually to people in their 20s like a very, very like painfully present question. But yes, there's no way really off the cycle. You can't get off the cycle of the law, the treadmill of the law, with more law. And I think that's what a lot of Christians do. In fact, I think that's what a lot of John Mark Comer's work actually is doing. It's reintroducing spiritual medieval monasticism to young people in a way that sounds great, because a lot of those rhythms are more humane. So you don't deny the fact that there's wisdom there, but you also say that's ultimately not the answer. The answer is the gospel. The answer is the fulfillment of the law in Christ Jesus, the putting to death of the old Adam, the dying and rising in Christ that we proclaim week after week after week after week after week. Which I think that your tradition actually is uniquely poised to. You have access to this. These are the preaching of the law and the gospel, I think, is at the heart of the Lutheran understanding of preaching. And I think if you're dealing with a culture that is on this intimate terms with the law of more, 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 better, 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 faster, 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 and we have this countercultural word, do we dare put the millstone around a person's neck of introducing spiritual optimization to them? You know? No, I think we come at it full volume with the forgiveness of sins and the absolution of the sinner. The completed work of Christ. That's what we do at our church, at least. And I'm seeing folks who come in and they say, this is the only place every week where I'm not given another thing. I'm not being told another thing that I'm failing to optimize, and I'm also given the space to breathe. Yeah, a lot of the churches that are growing are speaking the same language, I think. I don't want to sit here and judge all of it, because God works through all sorts of crazy churches. He has in my life, at least, you know. So I do see a hunger, though, for something that's different than more of the same. Ed, last thing, and then we'll take a quick break, I guess.
Can you address the risk of grace in context to, like, again, we're calling people from busy, crazy, ridiculous lives to come join us in crazy, ridiculous lives of busyness in the church even. So, you mentioned how many pastors are like ready for a sabbatical. Every one of us. I mean, reality. But the risk, I mean, you kind of addressed it a little bit with absolution, which is my favorite part of the service, is this declaration that for the sake of Christ's work, life, death, and resurrection for you, you're forgiven. Like, period, hard stop, and nothing. Like, the implications of that are huge, but it's the risk of telling someone, you're forgiven, period, because of what Christ did for you. Go in peace. And maybe everybody will just get lazy and go home and not do anything. And the danger of our church is, well, we got to mix a little bit of law in there to make sure that we get people to keep on giving. Because if they know they're forgiven without their giving a dime to the church, then, well, wait a minute. Then how am I going to get paid? Or how are the children's ministry going to run? Can you address a little bit of the risk of pure, unfiltered, full grace, and the reality that God's going to do what he does in his church, and in a better way, maybe?
Yeah, I think you've said it. Everything sort of needs to be said there, Ed. What we can do, I mean, if you're looking for a way to sort of raise money around this, just describe what we've just talked about. Who doesn't think their neighbors could use a little bit of gospel, Does anyone actually think that the answer to contemporary misery is doing more of the thing we've been doing? I don't think anyone actually thinks that. And so to invite people into the project of being these risk takers for the sake of grace is, I think, a really exciting thing. Of course, yes, the wanting to use the carrot and the stick of the law is going to be an ever-present temptation. And yet, I think there's a sense in which we make a slight distinction between, God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does. That's very helpful to say. Like, God doesn't need your money, but this church sure could use a new AC unit, Like, given what people are spending their money on, this is probably a better way to spend it. Like, I think there's no shame in saying any of that kind of thing. Your standing before God is not at risk. Like, that has been secured. You are baptized. You are sent out. We're sent out into a world of service. I do have a couple of constructive ideas for us that I'll share in a later session here. But yeah, it is the risk of grace that I've heard for 20 years about how irresponsible and risky and how people will run screaming for the hills and they'll never come back. I haven't experienced it yet. I have people who I thought were antinomians that keep coming back to church, and I don't quite get it. I was told that you'd be drinking beer in a ditch somewhere, but you keep coming back to church. I don't get it. Why do you want to have your kids baptized? Last week, we baptized the two children of a guy who, in college, after being a part of our small group and talking about forgiveness of sins, and really latching a hold and sort of rejecting part of his young life works righteousness, he started sending me pictures of himself sitting on literally a throne of beer cans and thinking this isn't what I unleashed you to do. This is not what I was hoping. Really, it's not what I'm hoping. Have I made a terrible mistake? Do I need to reel it back in? And then if I just waited 5 years, the guy gets married. He has 2 children. He's in church every Sunday because this is the place he finds life and nowhere else. But in my anxiety, if I'd said, I better reel in everything I said about the forgiveness of sins because of the natty light throne, I would not have seen him back in church. So let's stretch our legs for 10 minutes, and then we're going to, I have my book out there if y'all want to talk about that, but then we'll start back at noon. Thanks for listening, guys. Okay. Well, I've been told that I have a kind of a Scandinavian-influenced heritage crew here. And so, as a music fan, I had to go with my favorite Scandinavian music group, the most New Testament named of all groups. Who are we talking about here, everyone? ABBA. ABBA. I learned something. Why do I have ABBA on the slide behind the shape and destination of Christian leadership? Well, I'll tell you in a second. But before I do, I want to tell you something. I just recently read a book about ABBA, and I've been sharing the following tidbit because I thought it was so interesting. So ABBA were known for their incredibly ridiculous clothes that they wore, right? If you look at their outfits here, this is them before they won the Eurovision contest in 1974. I found out why they wore such ridiculous clothes, because they were in Sweden in the 70s and the taxes were so incredibly high that if you wanted to deduct your stage clothes from your taxes, they had to be deemed unwearable in regular life. That was the only way to deduct your stage clothes from your taxes. And so no wonder they were constantly wearing stuff that was deemed unwearable. That was the bar. That was the law you had to meet. And they met it. Good Lord, did they ever meet it. And in 1974, they not only met that law, they also won the Eurovision Song Contest with a song called what? Close, you guys. Come on. You got it. You can do this. Waterloo. They won with a song called Waterloo, which has the great couplet in it. I feel like I win when I lose. I was defeated, you won the war. I feel like I win when I lose. I put that up there because I want to talk about being a disciple maker. A friend of mine who's sitting in this audience, we were talking about this whole topic. He said, being a disciple maker is really less about leading than about following Jesus. It's less about leading in some kind of novel or fresh way that some guy from Virginia can sort of impart to you. And it's much more about following. And if we're following Jesus, we have to ask ourselves, what is the direction we follow Christ in? What is that direction? Is it upward? Is it downward, eastward, westward? Is it an ascent or a descent? Does following Jesus involve the removal of suffering in our lives? Does it involve self-improvement? Or does it somehow involve self-divestment and an increase somehow in suffering that actually yields a strange kind of joy? Well, I know that I'm in friendly company when I talk to you about the distinction between a theology of glory and a theology of the cross. Because when we are talking about following Christ, we are talking about the taking up of one's cross, following him all the way to Calvary. But this is very different from the form of disciple making and leadership that you find if you go to the leadership section in a Barnes & Noble, for example, these days. And you find all sorts of ways to optimize your time and to increase your effectiveness rather than taking up a cross and following Jesus in a cruciform direction. The theology of glory is simply the idea that God works primarily through victory and success. If you want to see God's handiwork in the world, look for the things that are going well in your life. God enables us to conquer our problems, and his will is basically in alignment with our will for our lives. So everything you hope for, God is simply the means towards that end, toward winning. A theology of the cross, in contrast, understands the cross to be the ultimate statement of God's involvement in the world this side of heaven. It identifies God as hidden in suffering. Martin Luther said that God was not only hidden in suffering, that God was he was at work in our anxiety and in our doubt. These were God's tools. In fact, God worked under his opposite, sub contrario. And that we see this primarily in the crucifixion, where his victory was actually in his defeat. And life came about precisely through death. As Luther so beautifully puts it, what this means is God receives none but those who are forsaken, restores health to none but those who are sick, gives sight to none but the blind, and life to none but the dead. He has mercy on none but the wretched and gives grace to none but those who are in disgrace. So if we're talking about disciples are those who follow Christ, if we're talking about what we are unleashed to, this is what we are unleashed to. A cruciform understanding, a cruciform path. A theology of the cross, in this sense, contradicts the assumptions that we normally have about life. Because it says that God is most reliably present, not in our strengths or our successes, or the things we like best about ourselves. God is working and present in the world exactly in the place where you are falling apart, where a person is discovering the limits of their power instead of its possibilities. This is a counterintuitive word. But if what I've just described is a world in which everyone is constantly being confronted with these limitations, then maybe we're positioned better than you could possibly imagine. Emily Dickinson, the great poet, wrote it this way. She says, "A death blow is a life blow to some, who till they died did not alive become, who had they lived had died, but when they died, vitality begun." She knows of what she speaks. Her work was, of course, completely unsung, unseen, unread during her lifetime. But our scriptures record a long history of how our Lord uses seemingly insignificant circumstances, weak and overlooked people, and bottoms-up moments to work out his will, which is, again, fortuitous, since life often feels like an endless process of becoming acquainted with our own weakness. The Lutheran theologian Ted Peters says that revelation through the cross provides negative knowledge, or at least paradoxical knowledge. We see weakness, but power is revealed. We see defeat, but victory is revealed. We see sin, but forgiveness is revealed. We see disgrace, but grace is revealed. And the great text is this one from 1 Corinthians. I'll read it to you. "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, for us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the understanding of those who have understanding I will confound. Where is the wise person? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For indeed, Jews ask for signs and Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than mankind, and the weakness of God is stronger than mankind. For consider your calling, brothers and sisters, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise." This couldn't be a less optimizable passage. Can we admit that? This flows so counter to what I've just described in the last session that I think on that strength alone we should take note again and again and again. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong, and the insignificant things of the world and the despised things God has chosen, the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are, so no human may boast before God. This is a profound reversal of values that Paul is articulating to the Corinthians. A picture of Christian leadership that would not be found in the self-improvement section of the bookstore, but in the grief section of the bookstore. I wish it weren't true. I wish there was another section we could go to. But this is the section also that all people eventually have to make their way to. The most effective disciple maker I've seen on a national, international scale the past few years is the musician Nick Cave. Now, you may know something about Nick Cave. He was a very transgressive post-punk Australian artist who was known for every kind of thing under the sun. And then as he's gotten older, he'd always write about God, but sort of mythically in his songs. But as he's gotten older, he's become acquainted with tragedy. And he's had not only one, but two children of his have died. One who fell off a cliff at, I think, like 4 years old. And another who died of an overdose at 17. And what Nick Cave has written about in his online, he has a web series called, or a newsletter called The Red Hand Files. And I think it's a must for anyone interested in effective witness in a contemporary moment that is cruciform in shape. I've run into more people, at least of my milieu, who've decided to take Christianity, give it another look, to take it more seriously, who've actually come back to church because of this guy. And it's not because he's been preaching a theology of glory. He's been preaching a theology of the cross. He understands the experience of life as an experience of devastation and loss. But for him, grief draws us close to the fundamental essence of things, a place where, quote, the idea of God feels more present and more essential. It actually feels like grief and God are somehow intertwined, is what he's on record with saying. You'd think, oh, that sounds like such a downer. Who would be interested in that? Well, everyone is interested in this guy's his testimony. Now, it's one thing for me to tell you that devastation is the doorway to healing and hope. And you won't have to believe me, but if someone who's lost not one but two children is saying that, and somehow, if you listen to read anything he says, he links it to Jesus specifically. And it's unbelievably compelling, and it reeks of the cross. It reeks of the cross of Christ. Leonard Cohen has a song called Anthem, which many of you might know, where he says, ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Now, this is how disciples are unleashed. Right? Are you glad you invited me? This is how disciples are unleashed. It's through the experience of devastation and loss and the love that you experience in the midst of it. That is not optional. The experience of loss, devastation, the crack that you experience in your life, it's not just voluntary. It happens to a person. The hope and prayer is that there's a preacher nearby when it does. And for Nick Cave, he attests to having gone to church in the middle of this, when everyone around him is saying, this is the event that should make you never believe in God, never turn to God. And he's saying, no, my friends, this is the only thing that could. This is what's so powerful about this. You can't argue with it. It's emotionally undeniable, as well as scripturally coherent. So what it means is disciple making in the context of this degree of cultural despair and distraction is the word consolation. Consolation. It's from the word console, comes from the Latin, which is to find solace together. Perhaps you know that. Consolation is what we do or try to do when we share each other's suffering and seek to bear our own. When we are searching for how to go on, how to keep going, how to recover the belief that life is worth living, that is when we are looking for consolation. To console is never to control another person, but to share in their sorrow, contending that somehow that sharing is enough to bear witness in the midst of sorrow to the one who can do something about what is going on. This is, Andy Root says it in this book, Evangelism in an Age of Despair, which I think is really wonderful. A world like ours, filled with sad happiness seekers in misery who are stuck in their self-imposed chateaus of fragile authenticity, what a phrase, needs evangelism and ministry not as polemics but as consolation, not as arguments but as visions of how sorrow itself is shared by God and brings peace and mercy. The way that Cave puts it, he says, Hope is optimism with a broken heart. I think that's a powerful word to us, those of us who are followers of Christ, the Christ who was crucified, understand what it means to say hope is optimism with a broken heart. That the crucifixion is somehow the ontological reality to which we bear witness, and yet it is also not the final word. And so it means that leadership, to the extent that we can do anything, it involves we die. Like that's what it means to be a Christian leader, is to walk in the way of the cross, to bear witness to the beautiful truth that God sacramentally enters into death to bring life. It's not fanciful. It's not an abstraction. This is what people actually do. I spent earlier this week at our church. The most profound spiritual experience I had was just talking to a guy who just finished his 4th round of chemo, who wanted to finally really talk about Jesus because he didn't know how he was going to leave his wife and children at the age of 46. I'm sure you've had experiences like that. There's no job description where you're supposed to do that other than the one that you currently have. It's the only job that says that that is a worthy and, in fact, the most important use of your time, to console as you have been consoled, to bear witness in the midst of pain. So forming leaders, unleashing leaders, is to follow them into their own Calvary with the word of the one who has gone before and ahead of and in our place. Now, I want to say this as I want to get a little heavier before I get lighter, because if we are truly interested in unleashing a generation of Christian leaders, then we have to. This is not an academic discussion. Despair is a very, very palpable reality. You guys, this is like, I don't want to use this, but this is where my current reality is. I woke up this morning to the news that one of my students from my college ministry days had committed suicide. This morning I found out, and he had killed himself because his father had walked into traffic himself 2 months ago. It's not abstract. Like either this stuff's true or not, it's potent or not, and I currently feel like I failed this guy by underestimating the level of despair that's been at the surface of people's lives. But I know this to be true when I speak with my friends in ministry. The level of despair is very real. I did college ministry for 15 years, and I don't do it anymore. But I had lunch before I wrote this big relief book. I had lunch with the guy who was still at it, and he said, Dave, the difference in 10 years. 10 years ago, when a young man asked to meet with me, 9 out of 10 times he wanted to talk about purity, pornography, something like that. Today, when a young man asks to bend my ear about something, 9 out of 10 times it's a mental health emergency. That's a very different situation in which we're trying to form disciples and meet them. And yet we are the ones equipped with the most beautiful good news that we could possibly have to meet those people in that, and to meet your own despair. Nearly everyone I know who's involved in pastoral ministry would corroborate this, that I don't know any churches who haven't experienced an uptick in funerals where the cause of death was despair related. More and more people would rather not live. And in fact, the gospel message is the only message I know that can address that head on. What is despair, though? Despair usually entails an alarming confidence about future doom. To be in true despair is to be captive, is to be totally leashed to an emptiness or darkness that surrounds you, that you think you will always feel. When you're in despair, you don't just have hope, you don't have any hope of hope. One of the reasons I am a Lutheran is because of the psychological realism at the heart of our faith, probably because of Luther himself, who was just so neurotic and so anxious and so full of Anfechtung that he speaks to me as someone like that, as someone who's dealing with people like that. If you are in despair, you might have you have confidence that there's no pieces on the board of life other than the ones that you can see. And if you've made a mess of your life or suffered some terrible setback, that's a very grim prospect. So a person in despair is leashed to a collapsed horizon of possibility. Enter the preacher who not only shares in that suffering, but bears witness to the God who operates outside of our horizon of possibility. And simply by hanging in there with the person, you are testifying to that reality. The God who does for us what we cannot do for ourselves, who has power that we do not, who is a worker not just of good deeds, but of miracles. Because the grace of God means that the horizon of possibility is never actually fixed. Not only are there pieces on the board of each one of our lives that we cannot see from our perspective, some of those pieces are beneficent. There are redemptive forces at work beyond our ability to summon or control or discern them, which include a God who forgives, a God who loves, a God who redeems and who brings life out of death, a God who possesses power that we do not. The possibilities for our lives and our lives of our neighbors are not restricted to what you and I can effort into existence, any more than it's dictated by what we've done or left undone, or even who we are. This is the rates of the deaths of despair per 100,000 people in our world right now. I'm reminded of that passage in John. Only 5 minutes here. Now in Jerusalem by the sheep gate there is a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew he had been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. So according to tradition, all the preachers here know that when the angel stirred the water, the first person into the pool would be healed. So this is where Jesus goes when he goes to Jerusalem. He goes straight there because the direction that he is leading is downward. It's not to the temple, it's to the hospital. It's not to the palace, at least. It's to the hospital. And once he's there, he finds the person who's been there the longest. 38 years would have been, longer than most people's life expectancy. And then we don't really know what's going on with the guy, but we know he has trouble moving. This is a painting Karl Bloch, the Danish painter, did in 1870, one of this very scene. And Jesus has this interaction with the guy, and he doesn't really even answer his question. But we can tell from the answer that his sickness is more than just physical. He's been excluded. He's been pushed aside. He's been cut off from God and from the holiest of holies. He's been overlooked. No relief. But Jesus doesn't require the right response, does he? He enters into this guy's reality. The reason I love this painting is because it shows him actually picking up the sort of tent, the kind of curtain that this guy's lived in. Talk about a collapsed horizon of possibility. All he can see is darkness. Jesus punctures it. He picks it up from the outside. He brings the light in. And he doesn't require the guy to have the right attitude because he doesn't have the right attitude. He gives him a script. He gives him a self-pity. He's not saying, "I'm going to unleash you if you pass my test." No. He does what he does because he does what he does, because of who he is. And it's a beautiful thing. This guy's convinced that one thing only needs to happen for him to be made well. He's got this prescription, and it has to do with what he can do he knows where the keyhole is, he just kind of can't get there to turn the lock. Some sort of effort he needs to be able to effectively pull off to heal himself. But Jesus isn't put off by his obstinance or by his self-sufficiency. He understands that sick people balk at healing and that that's part of our sickness. Instead, he comes to him in his despair, in the place he considers himself to be unhealable. He peels back that curtain with gracious intent. He punctures the cocoon of despair to which a person retreats in their pain, and he heals him. He heals him. He unleashes him. Jesus does it. Everyone else there just got to witness it. They got to follow him down the dirty stairs to the place no one wanted to go. And they got to be see at the bottom of the stairs the Christ who brings new life and healing into the skid rows of our lives. He does it on the Sabbath too. This isn't the law. This is something more potent and powerful. And it comes from the outside. It comes from the blind spot. And I'm going to tell one story. I have time for one story before we go. Because some of you who've read the book know this story, but I'm in Minnesota, so I have to tell it. I'm going to talk to you about this guy. Who knows who this guy is? That's Darryl Strawberry when he played for the what? The St. Paul Saints. And he's got a teammate there who's got no legs. Now, I grew up in the 80s in a suburb of New York City. It was situated baseball-wise squarely in Mets territory. So with what's happening with the Knicks, those colors, it hits something very deep in my soul. But I didn't know. Darryl Strawberry was the hero. He was the glory story of glory stories. He was a superhero. His name was Darryl Strawberry, for crying out loud. And when they won the World Series in 1986, it was basically the high point of my childhood. Sadly, as is often the case, the combination of celebrity youth and bottomless cash proved to be a curse as much as a blessing to Darryl Strawberry. The Mets had gained their reputation as the bad boys of baseball for a good reason. For Darryl, this involved abusing narcotics, and the addiction soon fueled all sorts of other antisocial behavior, so that by 1994, it had ravaged his life to the extent that he lost a multi-million-dollar contract with the San Francisco Giants. He also lost his endorsement deals, the adoration of the public, his marriage, and custody of his children. Suddenly, no one would hire one of the biggest stars on the planet. After the Giants let him go, he was turned down by 206 teams, which incidentally is the number of bones in the human body. He died. He was a dead man, a pariah, as far as baseball was concerned. Enter Mike Veeck, who himself was a pariah of a different kind. Mike Veeck was the son of the White Sox owner, Bill Veeck. And he had been fired himself after orchestrating the disco demolition night disaster of 1979. After that riotous catastrophe, Veeck resigned and fell into a lengthy season of addiction himself. It had taken him years, but somehow he regained a semblance of stature by helming the St. Paul Saints, not that far away from here, a minor league team that was known for their outlandish promotions and circus-like behavior. There's a documentary called The Saint of Second Chances that I talk about in the book, which is the best, most cruciform documentary I've watched in years. Well, when no one would give Darryl Strawberry a fourth second chance, Veeck, at the urging of his wife, Libby, offered the downtrodden star a contract to play for the Saints in 1996. Considering how many times Veeck himself had been on the receiving end of such undeserved grace and opportunity, he couldn't not do so, or she wouldn't remain married to him if he didn't. In signing Strawberry, though, he put his own reputation on the line to gift the struggling slugger a fresh start. But St. Paul is a long way from San Francisco. Professionally speaking, it was really the end of the line. It was a club populated by players and commentators and owners and mascots who no one else would take. I think they had a blind pitcher. How does that work? They had a blind commentator, excuse me, and they had they have the Dave Stevens here. So it was there that Strawberry makes friends with this guy Dave Stevens, who had no legs, which most people would consider having no legs as a non-starter, as a baseball player. But not for Dave Stevens. In fact, Stevens' perspective, his grateful perspective, jolted Darryl out of his self-pity and reminded him of how fun it was to play baseball. Their friendship became the catalyst for something new in the slugger's life. And in the documentary about the team, The Saint of Second Chances, Strawberry tells the camera, "Spending time with Dave Stevens, I realized I'm just not that darn important." This is the cruciform shape that life in light of the cross takes. When the wider world was telling Darryl Strawberry that he deserved nothing but scorn and possibly jail time, the repeat offender experienced the grace of God in St. Paul. He experienced the incongruous, superabundant grace of an owner and a population that revived him. He was resurrected. All of a sudden, he had a future where there had been none before, and soon Strawberry was back in the majors, winning 2 more World Series before retiring in 2000 and eventually becoming what? A pastor. Darryl Strawberry is a pastor. He just has a new book out this past month. His portion of the documentary ends with him saying, "I didn't want to be a superstar anymore. I just wanted to be." Humility, the cross, grace received at the bottom of one's despair. That is the how of unleashing disciples. And it doesn't really follow a formula, but I'm going to try to give you a little bit of one after lunch. Thanks for listening, everyone.